CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy. With me, Bekinkos Moyo, the Director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. I'm very excited today to be joined by Gill Bates. Gill, welcome to the episode.
Thank you so much, Becky.
Gill, I know that I've been trying to find a time to speak to you, and finally, at the, let me say, on the margins of our meeting here, focusing on women in African philanthropy, we managed to sit down together. But let me first start by introducing you. Gill is currently the CEO of the Southern Africa Philanthropy Foundation, former CAF Southern Africa. Maybe we should start there. Why the transition from CAF Southern Africa to the Southern Africa Philanthropy Foundation?
Thank you, Becky. Thank you for the question, and thank you for having me in conversation with you today. I'm really excited. The question why, that's on obviously everybody's lips. This has been a 2-year project in the making. Started literally 2 years ago when we had a sit down with our partners, our colleagues, our infrastructure, our networks. We realized that we had been in operation in South Africa for 26 years. And 26 years ago, we were in a very different environment. And fast forward to 26 years later, we started out initially as an intermediary, connecting funders with non-profit organizations, obviously with the major focus being on the support of civil society. With the advent of the enormous changes in the world globally, with the advent of COVID, we had to pivot. We could not be just an intermediary anymore. We had to become a thinking partner. We had to innovate, and we had to implement, at community level, together with our partners. And we realized that we needed a brand that reflects the organization we have grown into. So we're really, really pleased that we have the support of CAF in the United Kingdom. We have been a proud member of the CAF Global Alliance. We will continue to be a member of the CAF Global Network. So we continue to have our international relations. But at the same time, we need to focus on localization. Yeah. And consequently, we have now a name and a brand that speaks to who we are and what we do.
Yeah, I will come back to the new brand, but maybe let's take it back to 1997 when you started operations in Southern Africa. And my understanding is you then registered in 2000 here in South Africa. What was the context then, and what were the key issues that the Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa focused on in that period? And then we can take it to today.
The key issues at the time were the support of a strong and a resilient civil society, which our founders at the time believed, and we still do, is a core tenet of our young democracy. Because without civil society and the non-profit sector, our country would be in serious trouble. So the non-profit sector, rendering services on behalf of government at community level has always been our primary focus. And back in 2000, the non-profit sector was experiencing difficulties, was starting to experience resourcing difficulties. Obviously, during the apartheid era, funding was in abundance, and funds went straight from Europe and the Americas straight into the non-profit sector. So the non-profit sector during that time was vibrant and fairly strong. However, obviously, with the advent of democracy, the funding arrangements largely became bilateral. And consequently, we started to see a non-profit sector in crisis. And that really was foremost in the thinking of our founders, who wanted to establish an initiative that would focus essentially and entirely on building a strong and resilient civil society and non-profit sector. So that was pretty much the thinking of our founders at the time.
Yeah, so one of the products and maybe flagship initiatives that the Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa is probably known for is the World Giving report or index. What have we learned over the years through that important work that has been produced almost annually in terms of the trends in giving?
It's a really, really important piece of research. And as you say, the World Giving Index commissioned by CAF really sets out to establish and to monitor trends in generosity behaviours in countries throughout the globe. And the generosity behaviours that are measured are: to what extent have you donated cash to a non-profit organisation? Have you volunteered your time at a non-profit organisation? And have you, in the recent times, helped a stranger? And the trends have been absolutely incredible. We've been monitoring them over 10 years.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely no doubt. The latest World Giving Index was released in 2020 last year. And what we are seeing is that the gap between the global north and the global south in terms of generosity is absolutely closing. So it's what we've known all along. These trends are not surprising to us.
Yeah.
We've known that Africans and South Africans are a generous nation, and the spirit of Ubuntu is still robust. In the latest results of the top 10 most generous countries in the world, 4 are to be located on the African continent.
Yeah.
So while the media and analysts noted this and said, Africa is rising, we who work in the sector and the space know that in fact that Africa has been rising for decades. So as I said, this is not unexpected for us.
Yeah, but also that in addition to the 4 countries, and I think I know Kenya is there, South Africa is there, Liberia, and I think, is it Sierra Leone?
Sierra
Leone. In addition to those 4 countries, there's obviously other trends. For example, that giving to strangers is actually at the highest when you look at trends over time. So we give not just to those that we know, but we also give a lot to strangers.
We do.
And that speaks a lot to almost the identity and maybe the character of African philanthropy. Maybe we can talk a bit about what you as the foundation are actually seeing when it comes to, just the trends in giving, especially to those that we are not familiar with.
Yes, I think that's absolutely a spot-on observation. We are fundamentally generous as a nation. As you say, philanthropy takes different formats. Philanthropy is a very big word and certainly not widely understood. I think traditionally philanthropy has been regarded as high net worth individuals, international trusts and foundations that allocate money to non-profit organizations. But our practice in South Africa indicates a completely different story. Philanthropy has been in our country for as long as time itself. And we have a practice of giving. It is implicit in our DNA. It has not been formally documented in previous generations. It has not been formally measured. And I'm delighted to see initiatives such as CAPSI that are really formalizing the incredible generosity that has happened forever, whether it be within our families, our extended families, our neighbours, communities, vulnerable groups and societies. And it goes far beyond the traditionally narrow view of philanthropy.
Yeah, talking about giving, and of course I want to move a bit closer to where we are. So during COVID, we actually witnessed the extent to which different people at different levels actually give. We know now that high net worth individuals gave more than they had ever done in the past, but we also know that people, every person actually was concerned about the pandemic and its effects, and that people were actually giving. And you as CAF then put together an initiative that was meant to address some of the challenges that were faced by civil society. Maybe we can talk a bit about that initiative and the extent to which it was successful, or the challenges that it faced.
It was indeed a time of enormous crisis globally and also in our country. And so we put together this initiative to respond to the global pandemic and indeed further crises that happened in the country post the COVID period. We had devastating floods, we had devastating fires, and we realized that as an intermediary and as an entity that was in a position to allocate large amounts of funding into civil society, we needed to be ready, and we ourselves needed to be grant ready. And as the crisis hit, as we expected, donors and funders came forward and came to then Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa, and said that the major pandemic in the country now, aside from COVID-19, was hunger.
Yeah.
So funders came forward with money for food parcels, emergency, water, etc. But we hit a challenge almost immediately, because for once we had funding, but we were unable to locate our non-profit organisations. You will recall at the time the country went into a hard lockdown. Nobody was allowed to be on the streets aside from emergency people and those who had a permit to travel. So in the past, where we would have picked up a phone or sent an email, our team was grounded at home,
Yeah.
and the non-profits, of course, were not in the communities, not on the ground, and we could not find them. And it really, really was a challenge for us. And we found ourselves between a rock and a hard place, if you will, because the donors were saying, here's the money. We have a huge crisis in our country. Why is this money not moving?
Yeah.
And so one of the lessons for us was that we as an organisation have very, very strict governance and compliance processes, because obviously we are transferring large sums of money, sometimes small, into the non-profit sector, and we have to be absolutely sure that those funds go to where they are going to. And we had to look at our governance structures, which were fine and well when it was business as usual. But in a country in crisis, we had to re-examine that, and we realised that we were actually constricting and really delaying the process. And so the board was very accommodating. They understood that we were operating in crisis. And so we adjusted our governance requirements. We absolutely did not discard them 100%, but we loosened them to make the flow of funds easier. Yeah. And consequently, eventually, we found the organizations. We were able to transfer the money quickly and safely, and money went every single last cent to where it was intended.
Yeah, and that is probably one of your strengths, because I read somewhere that one of your key experiences is in the area of governance and compliance. And maybe we can talk about the role that you yourself brought onto that particular intervention, because you and I know that in leadership, it is the passion and at times even the experience of the leader that carries the day. So in this case, given your background, what role would you say, you were topmost worried about, and you actually brought your expertise to bear?
It's a very good question. And in fact, we wrote up a paper in consultation with yourselves. It was published at CAPSI together with our colleagues in the UK on how did we do things differently. And as you know, an experienced professional in the field over many decades, governance, legal and compliance has been a core imperative, certainly in my practice and in the practice of the trusts and the foundations that I've had the privilege to manage. However, these were times of great crisis. And in such a great crisis, we, and certainly I as the leader, had to leave my comfort zone. I no longer could rely on traditional governance, legal and compliance. Yeah. And I had to take a risk. I suppose it speaks to risk-taking. And I realized that the consequences, for our organization could be severe. But at the same time, I realized it was more important to get this money out. So it required a leap of faith, if you will. There were some worrisome moments. But that's what's required of a leader. One has to step out of the comfort zone, step out of the protection, the safety nets, and do what you need to do in the interests of civil society and the non-profit sector.
Yeah. So let's talk about you when you joined, CAF then. You came in at a time when you had already so much experience in corporate social investment, so much experience, like we said, in governance and compliance, working with BE, blue chip companies, trusts and foundations, having managed some of them whose companies were listed in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. As you get into this realm, what is it that you change? What is it that you keep?
It's a very good question, and in fact, it's been an exceptional journey for me, given that my experience lies both in the development and welfare sector, and then also, as you say, transitioning into the corporate social investment space, where I got to experience things from the corporate side. And having had that joint experience, when the opportunity to join Charities Aid Foundation presented itself, which required a leader that had experience in terms of both sectors, both the welfare sector and the corporate sector, it seemed for me as a leader really the perfect storm. I could not believe how fortunate I was to be requested to lead an organisation who primarily served the non-profit sector in partnership with the corporate sector. So that was an absolutely ideal moment. I understood, what was needed, what the needs of the non-profit sector were, what the needs of the corporate were, and effectively to marry that relationship, if you will. But obviously managing, different needs, different agendas, which again has required, insight, listening, willingness to learn. And it's been an incredible experience.
Yeah, and I know that you've got training in social work, but also in management, and probably one of the very few people that have got this combination, where there's the side where you are really dealing with issues of management, but you're also using that in the space where you are responding to humanitarian, but also social problems. Maybe let's use that and talk about how CAF and now the foundation has been engaging the corporate sector in order to respond to some of those social challenges.
We've needed to engage our corporate partners who I'm thrilled to say have really been willing to listen, to learn. There were enormous learnings during the COVID period, and traditionally the corporates would give us an instruction or ask us to allocate monies to a certain charity or non-profit organisation. But after the advent of COVID, we realised that we had to do things differently, and our corporate partners came to us and engaged us as thinking partners to understand how they could best impact their CSI spend, their so-called charity spend, in the best way possible to benefit civil society. So we've been amazed at the response of our corporate clients. We've seen enormous strides, particularly during COVID. A very traditional corporate with very strong and narrow CSR, focus areas, etc., came to us and said, there's a crisis in terms of the vaccine process in support of the government's vaccination rollout strategy, and people in rural areas could not access clinics for vaccination. And this particular partner of ours said, we need to roll out mobile clinics. Yeah. And we ourselves had never even thought of that. It was well beyond our experience and our knowledge. But we went on a journey together and we learned how to do it. Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa and now SAPIF, as a non-profit ourselves, we are able to procure goods and services, for example, particularly in the form of vehicles. We had the vehicles customized into a mobile clinic, and we were able to roll those out at a terrible time of crisis. And we've written that up as a case study, and just more and more opportunities came to us in a crisis, which we've been able to pilot and roll out for the benefit of the non-profit sector and ultimately communities.
Yeah, so maybe we talk now about the new direction, the Southern Africa Philanthropy Foundation. I couldn't ignore the thoughts in my head that part of branding is to take advantage of the moment. And I wondered, what is the moment for you and your constituency right now?
The moment right now is to build on the learnings and the experiences and the mistakes of 26 years of practice in the Southern African non-profit sector, and to apply it to extend and build on our offerings, but also to be part of a philanthropy ecosystem. We have more and more been engaging with our colleagues on the African continent. Obviously, CAF Southern Africa was located at the southernmost tip of the African continent. And while we were called CAF Southern Africa, we had not really gone beyond our borders.
Yeah.
And that was always something that we aspired to and wanted to do. And slowly but surely, we've been making those linkages. Obviously, we're a small organization. We're a very lean operation. We need to, keep costs down. Although we move large amounts of money, we ourselves are a non-profit organization, and ourselves do not have considerable funds for operations. So we've realized the crucial need to collaborate, which we have had experience with our CAF Global Alliance partners. And I'm really, really pleased to say that the CAF Alliance is extending, and we now have additional formal members in Africa. We have Dr. Grace in Kenya, we have Dr. Ben in Ghana, and we've really realized when we've met at different collaborations, different discussions such as this, or such as the one in Wings in Nairobi, that we need to be collaborating and building, I think as you've often spoken about, the philanthropy ecosystem on our continent and in our country. So that's really the now moment. We need to step forward, step upwards. The needs are enormous. The socioeconomic challenges are varied and complex, and we cannot do it alone.
Yeah. So in some of our academic writings and even spaces, there's always a debate between the use of the word charity and the word philanthropy. To what extent did connotations and meanings attached to each of those play in the new branding? Because in most academic spaces, anything that's charitable is said to be palliative, it's not transformative, it's not probably even developmental, whereas philanthropy has been positioned by many scholars as that which is transformative and developmental. I wonder whether that also played to the move towards dropping charity and using the word philanthropy.
Those words were incredibly important as we grappled with the new name and the new identity. And this has been a 2-year process, working with researchers, academics such as CAPSI, as we really, really grappled hard to find a name and an identity and a brand that really speaks to what we do. Obviously, Charities Aid Foundation, Southern Africa, was a name that we held for 26 years. We realized that the word charities does have negative connotations. It's paternalistic, it's patronizing, although well-intentioned, and we realized that's not who we were. Obviously, philanthropy is also an interesting word.
Yeah.
We work very, very hard with professionals, an agency, to find the right name that says who we are.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the debate around the word philanthropy is ongoing, but I have taken the view that for us to operate at a global and universal level, we've got to appropriate the term, because if we don't, then we are going to be sidelined. But at the same time, we've got to break it down in such a way that, if we are in Harare, we are in Nairobi, we are in Accra, we can break it down into local languages and people can understand what we are talking about. So I'm not really worried about the use of the word philanthropy, because I think we should appropriate it so that we can all, occupy certain spaces globally and universally. So what is the foundation going to be known for? What would be some of the key identifiers or markers that, going forward for the next 20-something years, you would want people to identify the foundation with?
We want to be known, going right back to our roots, as a champion and a thinking and implementing partner in support of Southern Africa's civil society. I think those initial, the basis for the initial thinking remains the same. And as we look at South African civil society in the year 2024, we see that the South African civil society and non-profit sector is again in crisis. and there is a funding crisis that we anticipated 20 years, which is now coming, manifesting. And again, we cannot see a civil society in South Africa failing. That is not an option for SAPIF, and that is why we are stepping forward and stepping up and reaching out to our partners like yourselves, like-minded individuals that want to grow and build a resilient civil society in South Africa.
And that's a good way for me to ask you this question, because in the continent, if we're talking about the ecosystem or the infrastructure organizations, we know that continentally there is probably a couple of institutions that we can refer to and easily say they can interpret the landscape for us. So there's the Africa Philanthropy Network, the Africa Philanthropy Forum. In East Africa, there's the East Africa Philanthropy Network, and I know there are attempts now to create the West Africa Philanthropy Network. In Southern Africa, as you know, in the past we used to have SACA, which actually collapsed, and then we used to have the Community Leadership Forum, and then we only have IPASA, which is focused on South Africa. But regionally, we are not really as organized as other regions are when it comes to philanthropy. And here you are now as the foundation, the Philanthropy Foundation for Southern Africa. It seems to me you are bridging and also addressing that gap. How are you going to work with some of these ecosystems and infrastructure organizations like the Africa Philanthropy Network and others?
It's exactly what we are wanting to do, and it is a gap that we have identified. It's really been very clear to us as we've attended conferences, met our African counterparts, and we've realized that in the north and the east and the west of Africa, there is an enormous degree of organization, of capacity, of expertise, which we believe is lacking in the south. So for us, we need to reach out, which we have been doing for decades, but we really need to formalize this collaboration, and we need to be very deliberate and consistent and focused as we work with yourselves and share conversations and dialogues and learnings, as we did today in the session at CAPSI and focusing on women in leadership in philanthropy. So for me, that's what the next steps are all about. It's been a long journey of 2 years, but the work is only starting now, and we are so looking forward to building the philanthropy ecosystem in our country and on our continent.
Yeah, and I think for me the timing is right, and like I said at the launch, I actually see so many opportunities. One, working constructively with governments across the region. If you look across the region, very few governments have got any formal relationships with philanthropy. The legislation is still very much aggressive to civil society and philanthropy as a collateral. You also don't see really much of transformative relations that actually exist. So there's one area where I see us in the region putting our collaborative efforts together to work with governments to really try and create and promote an environment that will make philanthropy thrive, but also for developmental purposes. But there's also the issue around the research, knowledge generation, which at least CAPS is doing, but also in partnership with groups like yourselves and others. And then the ecosystems work that we've just spoken to. So those for me are the opportunities that I would see an institution like yourself that is newly branded take forward aggressively as the new mandate. But having said that, we spoke a bit about you and your professional life, but how does Gill end up in the philanthropy space?
Gosh, I'm not sure that I can completely understand that. It's been the most exceptional journey for me. Starting out in social work practice, I was a crisis social worker at Johannesburg Child Welfare Society, learnt an absolute fortune straight out of university. I had no business being in that kind of a very serious environment, and then having navigated that, I was requested to set up a the Atuba Trust. Probably not many people will remember that, but that was on the back of the lottery, the Atuba Games lottery. And with lottery, every lottery needs a good cause side. And I was approached to set up the foundation, and I was quite taken aback because I felt I'm just a social worker in practice, and they said we need you to set up this foundation, and I did that. It was incredibly successful for 8 years, generating huge amounts of revenues for the non-profit sector, and thereafter I was requested to go and join various trusts and foundations in the financial services sector.
Yeah.
Again, learnt a fortune there. So I feel incredibly honoured and incredibly lucky to have been able to practice social work, to work as a corporate social investment officer and manager, and then ultimately to move to Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa, SAPIF. So it feels almost like the circle has been completed. So I feel humbled and really, really grateful by this development.
Yeah, I mean, at the launch, I actually challenged everyone and anyone who has never received philanthropy to raise their hand. Do you have any story that you want to share, either you as a philanthropist or you as a receiver of philanthropy? Partly because, as you know, at CAPS, we also manage something called Kisima, which is a giving platform, and we want to showcase stories of giving and how those stories have impacted on people's lives. All of us have got a story, but I don't know what your story is. There might be some, but is there one that you want to share with our audience?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I would not be here were it not for the generosity and kindness of others. Starting from childhood, growing up with a single mother, just had the love and care of family, neighbours, friends, educators, teachers, right throughout my life, my childhood, my student years when student loans were quite tricky. I managed to get a waitressing job that paid for my fees and helped get me through, and I would not be here today were it not for the philanthropy and generosity of others.
On that note, Gill, thank you so much for making the time and speaking to us. That was Gill Bates, the CEO of the Southern Africa Philanthropy Foundation, former Charities Aid Foundation Southern Africa. Thank you for watching us. See you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.